Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta, and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. Hope you all are having a great day. I'm stuck behind a school bus currently, so I figured what better time to pull out the old harmonica and play you guys a little tune called 100 Reasons Why the New Testament is Only About Israel. And let's see, today I believe... pardon me, so 5, 6, I believe we're on teaching number 7, or reason number 7, why the New Testament is only about Israel and her salvation, wherever she was. In the last number, reason, gosh, sorry, I got scatterbrained this morning. In the last reason, number 6, we looked at Romans chapter 1. And we looked at the portion that all the, hellfire and brimstone preachers like to point to and say, this is where Paul was talking about you and I, and we need to repent because we violated the Torah and we are guilty because of his invisible attributes, and he let us know. He's revealed it to us. Because of his eternal power and Godhead. So we're without excuse. Because even though we knew God, we didn't glorify God. And so we turned on God, and now we're guilty to God. All right, you know the drill. That's what they sit up behind the pulpit and preach to you. All the while missing the elephant in the room, that none of this was even about anybody today. All right, isn't it ironic and a bit comical that these people have the fachadas, I think that's how you say it, to sit up there, in other words, balls, to sit up there and proclaim a message that was actually all for Israel and dupe people into believing that it's actually about them today. So they throw a little extra in the offering plate. But, yeah, they do it. And Romans 1 is a real place where everybody kind of points to sort of condemn the Gentiles there. The whole world is condemned because although they knew God, they didn't glorify him, right? The whole world, right? Although they knew God. Now, mind you, this God pretty much never does anything for anybody in terms of, actual tangible evidence. He never really reveals himself in a real ironclad, undoubtedly true type of way, right? It's not like he's coming to people in their early stages of life when they're like 1, 2, 3 years old, maybe 5, and saying, hey, I'm God, okay, you know me, we have a great relationship, don't F this up, right? And then the person gets a little older, he F's it up, he drifts away. No, it's not like that. See, we don't have this God figure. Nobody does, really, and if they say they do, they're lying to you, and they're just basically trying to read their emotions. But we don't have a God that just reveals himself to us in such ways as the God of this particular story did. The God of this particular story parted the Red Sea for Jesus Christ's sake, okay? And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that this passage logically cannot work for anybody today, all right? It just won't work, but it will work for Israel. And as I showed in the last part, the last recording, Israel was the ones who had always turned on God. Israel was the only ones who were portrayed as knowing this God, and Israel were the only ones that were portrayed as going from a position of knowing this God and being in a relationship with this God to then turning on that and going towards dumb idols and worshiping wood and stone, the work of men's hands, and four-footed beasts and creeping things. So Israel was the one that fits that bill, nobody else. But we're going to continue on in Romans 1, and we're going to look at the closing portions of Romans 1, because we left off yesterday or the day before. We left off with the, verse 25. We left off on that. So we're going to pick up in verse 26. He says this. Now, he had just got done saying that these ones exchanged the truth of God with the lie, and they started worshiping these four-footed beasts and everything. And so he goes on, he says, for this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. Now, if you recall from the last audio, I quoted Acts chapter 7, where Stephen goes through the whole discourse of Israel's history. Starts out with the Abraham stuff. He goes into the Moses stuff and coming through Egypt. Then he goes into their rebellion, and he goes all the way through and talks about how they knew God and they turned on God and started worshiping idols. And it really matches what Paul says in Romans 1 beautifully. Go do a little comparison, excuse me, from Romans chapter 1, verses 18 forward, and look at Stephen's words in Acts chapter 7. And notice how Stephen's words are all about Israel. And then go back to Romans 1 and say, God, this looks strangely familiar to what Stephen said all about Israel in Acts chapter 7. And I think you'll get the point. But he goes through, and you'll notice from Acts 7 that Stephen uses the term or the phrase, God gave them up to vile passions and lusts and all this, and to worship the host of heaven. So Stephen talks about Israel very clearly. It's all about Israel. Just go read it. And he says that because they turned on God and started worshiping these dumb idols, he gave them up. He gave them up to these vile passions. Well, that's exactly what Paul says here in Romans 1:26. He says, for this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. God, that's so familiar to Acts chapter 7. He goes on, he says, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise, also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. Now, I won't get into this much because I'm driving and I don't want to run over little old ladies as they cross the street with their groceries. But what I will tell you is that I have done teachings on this very subject. I think I actually have a playlist all on Romans where I put all my Romans teachings in there. If you want to go check it out, look around the Romans chapter 1 stuff, and you'll see how I actually show from the Old Testament passages and portions that are all there that actually talk about Israel and their men and women basically engaging in fornication, sexual acts, all kinds of lustful activity, men with men, women with women. It says all this stuff, right? Wouldn't it be wiser to let the Bible dictate the Bible? Wouldn't it be wiser to let the details of the Bible define what's going on here in the New Testament? Because in the Old Testament, we have Israel becoming sexually immoral and God being disgusted with it because they were his people. They were being lustful. They were engaging in sex acts. It's all there. I can't recall the books, but it is there. Just go read it. All right? And they did all this stuff. So here's Paul talking about, for this reason, God gave them up and they started, men with men and women with women and all this stuff. And so that's clearly what the point is here. It's still all about Israel, right? But if we don't catch it in its big picture context, we're going to miss it. We're going to think it's about us today, which it's not. It just can't be. He goes on in verse 28, he says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. Now, think about that. Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. Now, I mentioned yesterday how the Old Testament is full of passages that say that only Israel knew God, right? Only Israel knew God, the Old Testament says. No other nation knew God. No other nation had his laws and judgments. Think about that. People say, all nations are under God's law. Here's the Bible. No other nation has God's laws and judgments besides Israel. Psalm 147. Deuteronomy 4 through 10. Romans 9, 1-5. Okay? No other nation. Amos 9. Israel, you alone have I known. You alone have I known. Okay, so here's Paul in Romans 1. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. So if Israel alone knew God, and Paul's speaking of a people here who knew God, but didn't want to retain him in their knowledge, because knowledge and knowing and knew, that's all the same, right? They knew God, they had knowledge of God, but they didn't like to retain it. And so God, again, it says, gave them over, or gave them up, to a debased mind to do things which are not fitting. Are you starting to see how Israel-centric and Israel-exclusive this is? This does not work with any Joe Schmo pagan, let me tell you. Okay? It just won't work. It only works with somebody who once knew God, with somebody who once had a covenant with God, with somebody who once had a relationship with this God, and someone who violated it, turned on it. And that's really the whole story of Israel's history. That's the whole Bible in a nutshell. Israel has a relationship, they F it up. Israel has a relationship, they F it up. God restores Israel, they F it up again. God punishes Israel, brings them back, they F it up again. All right? It's all about punishment and being saved. Punishment and being saved. Turning on God and God having mercy. That's all it is. It's just, it's like on replay over and over and over again. Same thing here in Romans. Okay, it's all about Israel. Then he goes on and he lists all these things that they did, being filled with all this sexual immorality, wickedness, covetous, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, whispers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. Right? Well, again, all these things are Paul's sort of way of talking about how far Israel had fallen through the generations, through their history, right? And this actually is also in the Old Testament when speaking of Israel. I think it's Isaiah goes into this pretty deep. It talks about how, you know, they're swift for violence, their feet doesn't know the way of peace, they're backbiters, they lust, they're proud, they're violent. It talks about he pulls from, well, Romans 3 pulls from Isaiah, where he talks about not one knows God, no, not one. But it's all about Israel. It's all contextual. Okay? And then look how he closes it up in verse 32. He says, who, so he lists all these things, speaking of these people, this group of people, and he says, who, knowing the righteous judgments of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. So this is important to pick up on. Paul is saying that these individuals that he's talking about that have turned on God and God gave them up to these passions, these individuals knew the righteous judgment of God. They knew it. Well, who knew the righteous judgment of God? Any guesses? Yeah, you know. What does Psalm 147 say? He declared his judgments to Israel. He has not done this with any nation. They have, the nations have not known them, it says. So think about that. Here's Paul saying that this group of individuals that he's talking about actually knew the righteous judgments of God, but yet the Bible says that no other nation knew the righteous judgments of God. Only Israel did. So there's your answer again, who this is actually about. But then notice he says this. He says, these ones know that those who practice such things are deserving of death. But they not only do the same things, but they also approve of those who practice them. So there's two groups there. There's the group that Paul is speaking of, this group that should have known better. And then there's a group of individuals who practice these activities, evil-mindedness, sexual immorality, wickedness, backbiters, haters. There's two groups, and Paul's comparing one to the other. One of them should have known better. Okay, one of them had the judgments. They had the instruction. They should have known better. They knew, but yet they still chose to do it anyway. And so that's the whole point of Romans 1 in a nutshell. And I trust you see how powerful that is. Folks, I'm going to leave it there for today. I hope you all have a great day. If you liked it, give it a like-a-rooski. If not, take a hike-a-rooski. And we'll catch you soon on that flip side. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.